All right, Kobe, since you are a little bit more versed in this than I am, would you like to tell us about what's going on with Julian Assange?
Yeah, so this week, Julian Assange is facing an extradition trial in England. So, for a little bit of context, Julian Assange is the founder of WikiLeaks. Most people have probably heard of WikiLeaks. They release documents that are given to them by sources, usually whistleblowers. They release documents showing, stuff that the governments around the world are doing. And so, a few years ago, he was facing rape allegations in Sweden. Those charges have since been dropped. But he ended up going to the Ecuadorian embassy in England to kind of flee those charges because his fear was he was willing to talk about those charges, but he was scared that they were going to use those charges to extradite him to the United States to face charges, relating to WikiLeaks. And so he was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, a really long time. He was like confined to one room in the embassy.
Yeah, like literally not leaving a building for
No, not
that
at all.
long.
I mean that must be mentally taxing in and of itself. But
I mean, we're all
so
getting
then,
used to it now.
yeah, now we all are. But so then, when the charges in Sweden got dropped, they thought, well, maybe there's a possibility that he'll be allowed to leave the embassy, and then he can go flee to another country. But then the UK, so the UK had charged him for fleeing the charges in Sweden. But once the charges in Sweden got dropped, the UK refused to drop their charges because they said that, well, he still, didn't go back to Sweden. So he
Yeah,
still
he still
technically,
did. Yeah.
he still violated our law. And so he's been in prison in the Belmarsh prison, which is a crazy high security prison where they keep like murderers and rapists and all sorts of other people. But he's been in that prison for about a year. And so he's actually probably served the amount of time that he was facing for those charges. But then, about a year ago, the Trump administration unsealed some indictments for Assange. So a little context on that. A sealed indictment is something that they had a charge for him, but they just hadn't made it public yet. So after these other charges got dropped, they made these U.S. government charges public. There's 18 different charges. I won't be able to get into all of them here. But one of them is espionage, and the core one that they're trying to get him on is conspiring to hack government computers, and I'll give a little more context on that. But he's facing up to 175 years in prison if he gets found guilty on all of these charges, which to me is crazy because, I mean, you don't even see murderers. You don't see killer cops go to jail for that long.
Yeah.
But so the core charge they're trying to get him on, the conspiring to hack government computers. So this is related to the Iraq war logs. They released these in about 2010. And so it was a bunch of documents showing war crimes that the U.S. was committing in the Iraq war. And we can detail some of those later on. But in general, they're claiming that he helped Chelsea Manning crack some codes on a government computer so that she could be anonymous in getting the documents and then leaking them. So basically, they claim that Julian Assange helped her hide her identity so that she could do it. And it was Bradley Manning at the time. She has had a transgender surgery since then. And what's so troubling about all of the charges, but that one also, is that if Julian Assange is extradited to the U.S. and then he faces trial here, if he's found guilty, it could set a precedent where journalists are not really allowed to work with whistleblowers like he did here. So it is pretty common for journalists to, help their sources remain anonymous in doing what they do. And so, for example, Ken Klippenstein is one of my favorite journalists, I think at The Nation. He regularly asks Department of Homeland Security officials to reach out to him through an app called Signal. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a app that encrypts your messages so that they can't be intercepted. But so that's just him in a different sense, helping hide the identities of his sources. But so if Julian Assange is found guilty and sent to prison for all these charges, outlets like CNN, Washington Post, The Guardian, and others, it'll be much harder for them to release classified information about government officials that are, is given to them by whistleblowers, because they could potentially get in trouble for the publication of these documents.
Right. And from what I know, you obviously know significantly more than me in terms of this situation, but just like in general, as somebody who also studied journalism in college, like this just the biggest I think, question going on here is like what you said, like this could set a precedent. Like, is this considered journalism or is this considered espionage, and where's the line? And like you said, like this could really affect the kind of the future of journalism, which is crazy to think about because he exposed bad things. Yes, he did an illegal thing to get there. So, but like where do you draw the line?
Well, and that's the thing is that, I mean, and I don't know the exact details of him helping crack a password and how exactly that might be a crime or not. I don't know the exact detail on that. But in general, that's what the U.S. government's trying to claim, is that he's not a journalist. He is a bad actor. He's a criminal. And so he's thus not protected. So they're trying to avoid setting that precedent, is what they're trying to do.
Yeah, the U.S.'s main argument is like espionage and crime against national security, and like that's what they're going with. Like that's their main like fighting point.
But the problem would be, I mean, Julian Assange has won over 15 different international awards for journalism for the work that he's done with WikiLeaks. And the New York Times, who actually worked with him to release these exact Iraq war documents, so the New York Times, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel, a German outlet, they all worked with him to release these documents that he's being charged for. And the New York Times actually won an award, a journalism award, for their coverage of these Iraq war logs that he released. And so that's where it gets particularly troubling, is that if he gets in trouble for his involvement with that, what's going to stop them in the future from going after any outlet, whether it be the New York Times or whether it be, you know, a small independent journalist? What will stop them from going after anybody who works with whistleblowers? And that's the problem.
Right, like it's almost being considered like an attack on free press.
And that's actually why the Obama administration didn't bring these charges forward. So a little more context. Obama actually granted Chelsea Manning clemency at the end of his presidency. So clemency doesn't wipe away the charge forever. It just kind of released Chelsea from prison. Trump actually sent Chelsea Manning back to prison because Trump tried to interview Chelsea Manning about Julian Assange. Chelsea Manning refused to talk, claiming it was double jeopardy. Got sent back to prison for a few more years. I think she's finally free again. But so in general, Obama didn't bring these charges forward because he worried that it would set a precedent against all journalists. Of course, Trump doesn't necessarily care about that. And so a little more. So the UN had a special rapporteur on torture that actually talked a little bit about this case, I think a year ago. And they said, quote, "My most urgent concern is that in the United States, Mr. Assange would be exposed to a real risk of serious violations of his human rights, including his freedom of expression, his right to a fair trial, and the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." And so I think the reason why that special reporter had that concern is that Chelsea Manning, the one who actually whistleblew these documents, Chelsea Manning was put in solitary confinement in a top high security military prison for months. So Chelsea Manning actually tried to kill herself in prison and was punished with even more solitary confinement, which anybody who knows suicidal ideation, you know, if you're suicidal, being put in solitary confinement makes it way worse. So that's a terrible punishment for that. So, of course, Julian Assange and the UN in general fear that Assange will face very similar punishments. And facing 175 years in prison makes it seem relatively likely that he will face those.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know this or not, but I guess I'm just kind of asking, like, why are they putting these types of people who are nonviolent? Like, yes, they're technically in the eyes of like the U.S. and the law, like they're a threat against security, but they're not violent. So like, why are they in these like maximum security prisons?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely.
Do you have any idea?
I mean, that's where I think we'd be getting into speculation. I mean, because
okay,
I'll try to go by their argument, and then I'll try to go by what I think. So I'm assuming their argument would be, since what he did threatened U.S. national security, and it's almost like treason is in their eyes how bad what they both did was. That's one of the highest crimes you can possibly commit, and so you get, you know, the harshest military punishment that you can get. That's how I think their side of it looks at it. Now, to me, I mean, it's kind of making an example out of Julian Assange so that nobody else will do what he did. You know, if you make the punishment for whistleblowing 50 years in a military prison in solitary confinement, if you make the punishment for publishing whistleblown information, if you make that punishment 175 years in prison, it's going to scare anybody from ever doing something similar in the future. And that's why a lot of people think this has to do with press freedom.
For sure. And
so,
like,
go ahead.
you're right. It's like, it's just like a really hard thing. Because like personally, my opinion, I think what it's like the overall greater good kind of thing. Like, you know what? Never mind. I don't even have an example. Just keep going, Kobe.
How so? When you say the greater good, are you thinking of it in sense of like, what he did was for the greater good, or the punishments for the greater good? Dive into that a little.
I feel like from a little bit of what I've watched and the language surrounding him and like even people who are supporting him, it's like, yes, he technically did something wrong, did something illegal, but it was in order to kind of open the eyes of the American people. And it's like, well, it's like, obviously the government, the military, there's tons of things that the American people don't know. Like, that's just like how it works. But I don't like, what did it hurt and what did it help? I guess I feel like needs to be looked at in order to consider what his punishment, if any, should be. It needs to, like, the outcome, not just the fact that he did it, because again, it's a whistleblowing thing. It's journalism, not necessarily like who's he spying for if it's espionage, you know what I mean? Like,
the worst. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I feel like he was doing it. He just tries to shed light on things. And again, this feels like wholeheartedly like I'm like a Julian Assange fan, but no, I just believe that the citizens of a country deserve to know what's going on in that country. So that's where I land, especially also as like a pseudo journalist.
All my cards on the table, I am a Julian Assange fan, so I'll just say that up front. But in general, so the worst thing that they claim that he did is that because there were some unredacted names in the documents, names of people who were basically spying for the U.S., giving them information, they claim that he put their lives in danger by revealing their identity. But the problem with that claim is that they can't point to any examples of anybody actually getting hurt. So there seemingly was no actual consequence. It's just the idea that there could have been a consequence.
Right, but to play devil's advocate, then it's like, well, does that set a precedent now for people to be allowed to release unredacted information? Like, I get that was a problem, kind of an issue, but again, I don't think he deserves 175 years in jail for that. But just playing devil's advocate, like, that is also an issue. Yeah.
It touches the gray area of, like, was there a journalistic benefit of including their names? Because sometimes I imagine to conceal their names would conceal relevant information.
Like the point,
would change the point of why you released it in the first place. I don't know in these specific examples. But before we wrap up, I'll just include, just so people have some context of what the Iraq war logs released, because there's a lot of crazy stuff that was found in those logs that I don't think people realize was released. So I'll give a few examples of what the Iraq war logs revealed, just so people kind of have a little bit more relevant context, since that issue was so many years ago now. So one of the things that those documents revealed was that the U.S. had a torture program on suspected terrorists. And so that was really troubling to a lot of people at the time. It also revealed 15,000 previously unknown civilian deaths. It helped those people be identified. I'll quote this BBC article. So, quote, "One of the WikiLeaks documents shows the U.S. military was given a video apparently showing Iraqi army officers executing a prisoner in the northern town of Tel Afar." So that's one case. Another case, U.S. soldiers suspected army officers of cutting off a detainee's fingers and burning him with acid. There's another incident where an Apache helicopter was shooting at some people that they suspected of firing mortars at a military base in Baghdad. But those two men were actually trying to surrender at the time. And when the soldiers asked the lawyer whether they could accept the surrender, they were told no. And so they went ahead and shot the people who were trying to surrender.
Oof.
And those are just a few examples, so you can see why Chelsea Manning felt the need to release this information, because, the U.S. was committing war crimes and basically nobody was hearing about them. And so, in general, it's very telling to me that they bring these charges forward, 10 years later, 12 years later, and especially after he releases more information about, the Democratic Party in a completely separate leak. It's almost like he's alienated all sides of the political spectrum, the political elites in the U.S., both Democrats and Republicans. And so now there's kind of this bipartisan consensus among the establishment that he is a threat to national security and he must be made a lesson of. And, and it's a very divided topic. I tend to think a lot of the public, like you said, kind of how you come at it, they're not necessarily Assange fans of him personally, but they see the value in what he released. That's how a lot of the American people see it. And then there's a lot of government officials who look at it purely through the perspective of he's a national security threat, he must be made a lesson of. So
right.
It'll be interesting to see where the case goes from here. If he gets extradited to the U.S., it'll become a much bigger story because, right now it's just deciding whether England will send him to the U.S. or not.
Oh, I think a judge rejected his bid to delay the extradition.
Well, they haven't
double check that.
It hasn't been finalized yet, as far as I know, because they were still going through the trial earlier today. But they're still going through the extradition trial, and once that's done, and he's definitely sent to the U.S. or not, hopefully not, but once he is sent to the U.S., then I think the issue of the free press and the relevance this case has there will definitely pick up steam in the media.
Alrighty, that is all we have for you guys today. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you give it a like. And if you want to hear more from us, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can follow us on our other socials by liking us on Facebook at Back Pocket Report, following us on Instagram at Back Pocket Report, and also on Twitter at BPR News Pod.
Next time you're looking for news, don't forget to check your back pocket.